Yeah, I
I've
know.
posted that
We can
already.
always allow public comment. Department directors to come. Department directors have already been invited. There you go.
So, but if you wanted general public comment,
Tell him and ask him.
Yeah, John Roberts. Oh, okay.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 15th special city council meeting for the city of Rapid City budget hearing. Our first order of business with the roll call and determination of a quorum.
Roberts. Drury. Laurenti. Armstrong. Lewis.
Here.
Solomon. Modrick. Nordstrom. Drew. Scott. We have quorum.
Everybody please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, I'd like to just give a quick, brief overview of how this goes this evening. This is essentially a working session of the council. We used to do them down in front back in the day, but we've kind of moved up to the dais just because it's a little more convenient for us and for getting information back and forth. What we're going to do here is this is basically just for us to, basically as a council, to understand what the budget's all about. We haven't had a huge amount of time to dive into it and get all of our questions answered at this point. So I think we've decided as a group that's very vital that we understand what we're voting on before we start voting and making cuts and additions and everything else. So this time we're not taking public comment for those very reasons, because it's more important that we as a council understand what we're voting on. I think so. I would rather have that happen than, I understand that you'll have your time to speak and to express your opinions. We've got your emails, we've got your phone calls, and we are listening to you. It's just a matter of us getting a better idea of what we're actually working with here. It's $160 million of your tax dollars. I'd much rather have us well-informed and knowing what we're talking about before we can go forward. And everybody has a copy of the budget up here, and the way we're going to run this is there's an outline basically of what we're going to go through. If there's anything you'd like to add to that outline, please feel free to speak up. And I also would urge you, when we're going through these line items, try not to get too far into the weeds as far as like if someone spent $100 on pencils in their department. We do trust them to do those jobs. And well, I think it's more about the big picture here. If we can help it, unless it's something just absolutely glaring you wish to talk about, I'd appreciate that. So with that said, is there anybody who would like to discuss any particular item at this first number one, maybe the 2018 revenue sources reallocation that's proposed? And we'll go to Richie Nordstrom first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a little clarification, if you would, before we get into the business of this, is that the opportunity for public input, could you re-clarify that? So if the public wants to have an opportunity to input, what's the process that we're lining up for that?
Well, like I said, this is a working session at this point. We've not historically done public comments at historic working sessions. We're trying to get an overview of what we're working on here, and so we understand it better. The public is more than willing to, has going to have plenty of opportunity to comment at a later date. Tonight, it's just more about us understanding what we're voting on here and we've been proposed. The mayor gave us a very broad overview, and it's time for us to kind of get down and figure out a little more about what we're talking about here. So,
agreed. And then the other part of it is that if we need a special session for public comment, I'd be receptive to that, so I get an opportunity to hear what the public has to say. But that also doesn't mean that they cannot continue to call and email us as well. So I'd encourage that as well.
Absolutely. I appreciate your comments.
Yield.
Any further discussion about the 2018 revenues reallocation of sales tax? And we'll go to Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And sorry, are we discussing the revenues at this point? You said something else, so maybe I missed it.
I apologize if I got too specific. Basically, it's just about anything you want to discuss about the revenues. If there are any questions you have about, I know that you had some concerns about different reallocations of the sales tax and or the fees and increases and things like that. So this is a chance for you to discuss that and your ideas.
So,
Sean's here, and I think the mayor's somewhere around here.
that's what I was looking for, is the mayor here, or Sean, are you answering all of our questions tonight?
He-
Oh,
I believe the mayor's on his way out. Okay. Could someone grab the mayor for me? Is he coming? Please. I assume he may be sitting at he's coming, okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. You have the floor, Amanda.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Mayor. So, just looking at the revenue streams, and that's the part that we're talking about right now, it looks like that the goods and services in 2015 were $2.2 million. The actual was 2.3, so the city actually collected more. But then in 2017, you proposed 2.5, and in 2018, you're proposing that that's going to jump up $2 million to 4.5. Can you answer what sales of goods and services on the revenue side that's going to increase $2 million?
I can't answer that right this moment from memory. I would have to go back and look and perhaps even consult with finance again about it. There's 5,000 lines in that spreadsheet, and so I can't remember that one specifically.
Okay, I'm not even looking at the line item budget. This is what you presented. So I'm starting there at the top level and then working the way down. But if you need to come back with that one, that would be one question that I have is, what constitutes that $2 million increase on the revenue side for 2018 for goods and services?
Yeah, the data drove the PowerPoint presentation and the pie chart that you see there.
Okay. And then the interdepartmental charges were increased $400,000, and I'm just rounding figures here, for the 2018 budget, but you had also increased them from 2016 to 2017 last year by 4% and an additional increase in revenue of 8%. Can you kind of explain the increases in the interdepartmental charges?
Well, the increases, I believe, from 16 to 17 would be based on projections of the need for services in those departments. But again, I don't remember the specifics about that at this moment.
Okay. I think we received something here tonight too about property taxes. In 2016, the actual property taxes were $15.6 million, so $15,600,000. In 2017, and I know we valued that or estimated that last year on that old formula of 2% plus 2% from the 2014 or something like that. This year, based on your presentation, I thought you went about that a little bit differently. But it shows an increase of 8% from just 2017, and 2017 was about a $500,000 increase, and this is going up an additional more. Do you have some other data or a different formula that you used, or did you use the same formula on the property tax revenue estimate?
On the property tax side, there is the knowledge that a few properties are coming off from completed TIFs and other items of that nature, and so those have been added in.
So that's going to be real estate or property that's coming onto the tax roll, that the incremental portions of those taxes were being paid out for the developer's cost of that?
Yeah, the TIFs are complete in, I don't remember the specific properties, but that was the reason for the increase.
Okay. And then the other projection was from 2016 to 2017. Sales tax was estimated for an increase of 7%. It jumped from the actual of almost $25 million to $26.5 million. And then the projection for 2018 for sales tax is increasing an additional 6% up to $28,400,000. Is there, I mean, we've all seen the sales tax fluctuate, and I know in your presentation you said June caught up, and we were actually sitting at our 2% increase that we're kind of used to seeing. But 2% is a long, far way away from 6% increase for the projected revenue. Is there something else that you're anticipating coming on board for sales tax? Was this the reapportionment of the 2 cents that you talked about?
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly you're looking at.
This was your presentation? These were your numbers presented?
Okay, on which slide?
Well, I'd have to count in here. It was slide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, sorry about that. This was divided up. It was slide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your preparation, your budget preparation.
Okay, well, I don't have it. I wasn't prepared for this type of detail here right now, right off the bat. Maybe you could show the slide to Pauline and she could give some insight to it.
Did you hear the question that I'd asked Pauline? So the sales tax was in 2016 actual almost 25 million, and then it was estimated or projected to go up 7% for the 2017 budget to 26.5 million, and now for the preparation, it's estimated to go up 28.4 million. Was this the proportionment that the mayor was shifting, that 2 pennies, or was there other added economic conditions that were going to increase sales tax considerably, like 6%? We're used to seeing our 2%, but.
Right, so that number is the 2% plus 2% over 2016 actuals, and then projecting out to what that would be for the full 2 cents, and that is for a whole penny sales tax
Okay,
revenue.
so part of this is that old formula of the 2% plus the 2% from 2016 actuals. And then the additional was the actual shifting of the pennies that the mayor presented as if that's what the council chooses to do and adopt.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think those were my questions concerning the revenue. So I've kind of written them down, Mayor. I'll send them to you so that we can follow up on them.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And up next, if you need to go take a break or something, get some water, I don't want to keep you up there all night.
Well, be in
Nice.
earshot. You can just.
Okay.
No.
We'll go to Richie Nordstrom, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick comments. We're not ready for, or we're in the process of going through transitioning to priority-based budgeting, but we're not quite there yet, correct?
The 2018 budget is the first full year of implementation for priority-based budgeting.
Okay.
So it's implemented, yes. However, it's our first year of implementation, so all of the programs that we've identified that's a new process for us. So by the end of this year, in the end of 2018, we may see where we didn't identify problems accurately, maybe we identified too many and so on. So there's a continual improvement process, but we are in fact implemented in 2018.
Just to make sure you understand, I'm very comfortable with the direction that you're going. We've still got a little long, in my opinion, a long ways to go to get to what I understand as priority-based budgeting or PBB. So overall, I like it. Yes, I've got some areas of grumbling that I'm going to be doing. So if you've got one more chance to answer a question for me, I was coming up with some discrepancies on the interdepartmental charges slash PILT, the bills. I was coming up with some different numbers. Did you have a chance to look at that email or
Excuse
that
me, Mr. Nordstrom?
PILT
To
numbers?
to interrupt you, but we do have that as a separate item on here. We're trying to stick to the revenue sources at this point.
Okay.
So if we can get to that in a little bit here, give the mayor maybe a chance to look it up. But we're trying to stay with the 2018 revenue source and maybe the discussion on the sales tax reallocation, if that's, or fees, whatever it is you want to discuss. But I want to try to not jump around too much, just so we can
Okay.
same page if we can.
I'd appreciate your input as to when I can bring up these questions.
It's right in front of you. There's the-
No, I mean my questions. When do I get a chance
Sure,
to bring
right
those
here
up?
on item number. I have it down in this little outline.
Okay. All right.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll go to, are you done, Mr. Nordstrom? It's in your folder, Reggie. It's in your folder. It's not there, you can get one of them, you can. We'll get you another one. I'll keep looking through. Okay, thank you, sorry. Are you done for now, Reggie? Reggie, are you done for now? Are you finished for now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Chair recognizes Steve Laurenti.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mayor, for being here for tonight. Looking forward to the rest of the budget hearings as well as we work through these questions that the council has. I was very well impressed with the budget that you presented to us. I think it takes some serious steps that the city government has neglected for quite some time, especially where the vision funds are concerned. I'm hoping the council can build on that. So I do like that. From the revenue standpoint, I just wanted to clarify because I was a little confused during your presentation, and maybe the finance officer can chime in too if I need further clarification. But as I look at the numbers that I requested from finance on property tax and sales tax revenues, which obviously are our largest revenue sources, from 2006, and I think you were using 2006 as the starting point up through 2016. I'm not sure if you were up through 2016, but that's the last final numbers we had. What I have calculated is that we had a 54% growth in property tax total revenues from 2006 to 2016. And then with sales tax, we had an overall growth of sales tax revenue from 2006 through 2016 of 43%. And that's based on the numbers that I'm looking at in front of me right now. So I thought I had heard something a little bit different in your presentation, but I just wanted to get those numbers out, not only for everybody to look at, but obviously she ran those. So because I wanted, after hearing your presentation, I was a little confused about the 26% on assessed property value, and I don't know if that was property. I don't know what that was, that 26% growth on assessed property value from 2006 to 16. That was a number you gave at your presentation. So maybe that is different than the total property tax revenues than what you presented. So I wanted to just clarify that because it's more than double of, than what was presented. So that's why I wanted to bring that up, and maybe we can look at that to see what the differences were in your presentation to the actual total property tax growth from 2006 through 16. My other questions are on some other subjects. So, but although this one question does have to do with revenue, I just wanted to find out, are we taking a CPI, and what percentage are we taking for the projected 2018 budget?
Okay, in order, on the 26% property valuation, is there a sheet that you're referring to in this presentation or not?
Yeah, it was the 20, you had from 2006 to 16 assessed property value with a 26% overall growth from 2006 to 2016. I wrote that down as well. Okay. Now, I don't know if it's in your written presentation, but I remembered writing it down from your verbal. Okay. So,
well, it's my sense is, and I didn't bring the copy of my little introductory statements, but my sense is that it's overall property valuation. So there's a total valuation of all the property in Rapid City that has gone from $4 billion up to 5 or
Okay.
something of that nature.
There you
So-
go. That could very well be it right there.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about purely just revenue. So that could definitely be it. So I just wanted to make sure that I was thinking correctly, that what you were presenting was not in fact revenue growth, but
No, it's
valuation.
not. It's overvaluation.
Okay,
Overall
very good.
valuation. And then secondly, in this budget presentation, there is a CPI increase of 1%, which results in about $100,000. And the question on the table that should be answered by the council this year is whether or not to let the 2015 CPI fall off of the chart, or whether it should be collected. So I know that's stirring up a hornet's nest, and I'm not doing that just for fun, but I think it's a healthy, legitimate conversation that the council should have on a revenue philosophy level. So we have to decide if we want to take the 2015 CPI now, or if we don't, it's gone.
But that's not calculated in your 2018 budget?
That is not calculated in there.
Okay. From what year is the CPI that you're pulling the 1%? Is that 17?
16.
17?
17.
Okay, that's what I thought. It was 17. Okay, that's all the questions I have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Laurenti. Just as a point of order, I guess, if you have any questions or anything like that, just by all means write them down, and we'll try to get them presented for next council meeting so we can all be on the same page again.
And I do have that. I'll make sure that I put those to the mayor's office
Absolutely.
as well.
And I think, and in fairness to the mayor, he did request we have all these questions to him ahead of time, and
Yep.
I think we've probably put him on the spot here. It's not the intention by any means.
No, that's okay. I don't mind. And we are working on those answers. It's just that I'm in the middle of a huge answer right now to one question that I'm minutes away from finishing up, and then we'll be cranking those out tomorrow at a pretty good rate.
Sounds great. Thank you, sir. I'm going to go to Pauline Sumption since you jumped in here.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that this actual rate for the consumer price index is from 2016, but then we multiply it by the 2017 tax request base, and so it's about $161,000 is what the total is. So it's a combination of 16 and 17.
Is that it? Okay. Thank you, Pauline. I'm going to go back to Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to buzz back in because when Pauline came back, she answered the first two questions. So to save the mayor some time, since Pauline had the answers, I'd just like to go ahead and Pauline help me out if I get this wrong. So my first question concerning the sales of goods and services, and it had increased $2 million. Pauline stated, Mayor, that this was part of your taking a few enterprise funds and putting them into the general fund. So the golf courses actually generate $1.3 million in revenue. So that's $1.3 million of it. And then she said the cemetery is roughly about $150,000 in revenue. But she said something new this year was the contract with the airport with the fire departments. That's also part of that goods and services of $550,000. That's pretty close to the $2 million in sales of goods and services. So that's the $2 million increase because we're taking those into the general fund. Then the one on the property tax, Alderman Laurenti had already asked, and the mayor's presentation, according to Pauline, does include the CPI of 1%, but it also includes growth, and those numbers generally come from the county, based as well as what the mayor had stated with a couple TIFs that are coming off. And so those property values will be coming into the city rolls as well as the school and county. And then the other one was the sales tax. And from what Pauline told me is that, yes, the sales tax was calculated for the 2018 budget based on the old formula of 2% plus 2% based on the 2016 actual sales tax. But then, Mayor, it also did include your recommendation of reshuffling those 2 pennies. So this would include the whole penny going into the general fund. So that's what increases it to that 6% over the 2017. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I just figured I'd try to save the mayor some time if we had the answers here tonight concerning the revenue side.
No, and that actually leads me to my other statement is this is, folks, this is why we're doing it this way, because it allows us to have a discussion. We'd be having this meeting otherwise, in front of all you all can tell what we're doing. There's a lot of transparency here. The questions, there's no hidden ideas, or it's all very out in the open, and that's just basically what this working session, so for us to have discussion. And another reason we have Amanda sitting down next to the finance officer, because she tends to generate the most poignant questions about the budget, so I appreciate that. Mr. Laurenti.
Thank you, Chair. And some of Amanda's comments, Alderwoman Scott, sorry, her comments on the TIFs that we're anticipating. If I may, I'd like to ask the finance officer a question, just as part of the revenue projection for the 2018 budget. Pauline, thank you. Pauline, so we have TIFs that are going to pay off. The increments are going to pay off. So are we're basing some of that budget on that increased property valuation that we're going to be anticipating getting?
The one in particular that we included in the calculation is the TID 71. We've already dissolved this. This is the South Robbinsdale TID, aka the Southside Walmart. It paid off quite a bit early, and based on the current valuations, that will bring about $76,000 in city property taxes, and then obviously the school and the county will get their fair share of that as well.
And is that the only one that is being calculated in the projection?
It is, because the other one that we dissolved this year was for the President's Plaza one, which it's city property anyway, and it didn't have any additional increment on the value, so there wouldn't have been any additional taxes anyway from any, and we're tax exempt, and then the adjoining properties didn't have any increment, so there was no effect on the property taxes received. I'm not projecting anything that may be dissolved between now and through next year, just because that's an unknown until it happens. So.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we were not projecting something, counting our chickens before they're hatched, kind of thing. So thank you.
Not in this case.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And any more questions or discussion on the 2018 revenue at this time? We can always bring them back later, so you don't have to rush in just to ask a question. But if you do have something, Mr. Mayor, if you want to have a seat, you're more than welcome, sir. We don't want you to have to stand there all night on the spot. So any more discussion on the revenue sources for the 2018? Okay, we're going to move on to discussion of the general fund reserve policy, general draft of that. Does anybody have any questions regarding the general draft fund reserve policy? Okay, Amanda Scott, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In reading the reserve policy, or the draft of the reserve policy coming forward, and Sean, I hope I get this right. In reading the draft, I was a little confused because it looked like it was splitting up into two different reserves, one for stability, one for emergency or crisis. And it looked like it was two of them. From what I understand, we're actually still looking at one reserve line. The drawdown on them is that 8% of that reserve, of that 15% reserve line, would be available for crisis, approved by the council by 2/3 vote. And then the stability portion is the other 7% of that 15. So we're still, bottom line, we're still looking at a 15% reserve line. It's just that if any money is taken for stability or for crisis management, two separate plans are drawn up on how to put that money back in over either a 3-year period or a 5-year period as specified in that draft. So I thank Sean and I thank the mayor for providing that answer to me early, because I was trying to figure out, because it was talking about minimums and targets, and so I think I have it. I see Sean shaking his head yes, so I think I have it right. All right, thank you. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, ma'am. Up next, Mr. Steve Laurenti again. We might play tennis here.
Thank you, Chair. We're on the subject of the reserve. Very good. I just want to make sure I'm staying on tack here.
Someone has to watch you. Yes, we're on.
I know, right? So I have a question for the finance officer, I may. And this is a question that's come up since some of this discussion's already began. But Pauline, if you would, please. One thing I'm not clear on, and this is really a question that can be answered at the next budget hearing, is the replenishment process. I'm not real clear on how we're going to do that, specifically revenue and the sources to replenish that. I assume the 8 or the 7%, the part that we can use. So if we can get some clarification on that, that would be great. I mean, how will we replenish that? What will be the sources of income to do that, the sources of revenue? And then how long will it take to replenish it? Is that all in there? Because I'm not clear on that.
To be honest, I have not reviewed the whole proposal. I will tell you that generally speaking, the easiest way to replenish it is your revenues have to exceed your expenditures.
Okay, because that makes me, that's where I'm a little nervous, is we want to spend 7% or about 45% of the entire current reserve, 40 to 45%, without having a very specific plan about how we're going to replenish it. So I'm a little nervous that we would be relying on something we don't have.
My understanding is the plans have yet to be drafted after the policy is accepted. As far as how long it's going to take to get the money back, obviously it's going to depend on how much money you end up spending into the reserves.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll go back to Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I may have this wrong, but I believe when I asked the question, Alderman Laurenti, those were the same concerns I had, was how that all worked. And again, I'm looking at Sean and I'm looking at the mayor to make sure I got this right. Because this is a draft, it still has to be approved by council. So I appreciate the discussion, because I think we better all understand what we're approving if we choose to go down this road. The reserve line, from what I understand, is that 8% is for crisis, like emergency, something happens. We still have to develop a plan to try to recover that, but I believe since it's a crisis and it's 8%, that one I think once we dip into it, we then come out and set up a 5-year plan to recoup those monies that we had to dip into. The 7% stability side still takes a vote of the council to dip into it, but that one, if I remember correctly, the draft, then after we dip into it to maintain stability, sales tax doesn't come in, or property tax is low, or whatever, goods and services is low, and we have to dip into that, then we need to come up with a 3-year plan in order to put those funds back into the reserve. So the plan, from what I understand, I'm looking to Sean, I'm kind of getting a half nod. The plan as drafted is actually developed by the city council at the time or shortly thereafter that we agree to dip into the reserves. So, thank you.
Mr. Laurenti, you still have the floor? Or you want the floor back? Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I'll be honest, if that's the route we're going with it, Sean.
Sean, could you step to the podium,
if you
please,
would,
sir?
please.
And identify yourself just for the folks at home.
If I may, since the working's at, thank you, because I know Sean can explain it a lot better than I could.
Absolutely.
Sean Kurbanov, budget analyst with the mayor's office.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And I'm very nervous about it now, because I'm hoping as we get through this budget process that we're going to have something concrete, because there's no way that I would encourage my colleagues or myself to support something where we are going to agree to use part of the reserve for stability. And I don't have any problem with that on its face, except that when we're talking about a replenishment plan, that needs to be in place before it, because I want something that future councils can't just throw aside and say, you know what, we're okay with half of the reserve we used to have. And not only that, we don't even have any idea from what funding source we would use to replenish either of those funds, the stability or the actual emergency reserve, which is really all it is now. So I'm hoping that maybe some of my comments here and maybe some of my colleagues can speak about it if they want, but that we need something a little more concrete than saying we're going to put 40% or 45% of the current reserve into a stability fund, which means we takes the pressure off of the council, well, mainly the staff, mainly all of the directors, to have to budget within the revenues that the taxpayers are giving them, because that's ultimately what it's all about. I mean, the bottom line is the stability fund, in my opinion, at least as I'm talking through this, means we're not doing what's necessary to keep ourselves within the amount of revenue that we're seeing come in during that budget year. So I'm a little nervous about having a stability fund Because to me now it's got this connotation, and this is in my mind, that it's a fallback for us just in case we don't want to actually make the hard choices and make the necessary cuts to match the revenues that we're actually getting, not what we projected. And that's really not a question for you. It's just a matter of, can we get something more during this budget process before we say yes or no? Because I'm going to be lobbying my colleagues to vote this down as quick as possible if this is all we're going to get. So I just wanted to throw that at you and that challenge, and hopefully we can get something more concrete. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And just as a possible clarification, this is an ordinance, so if we have a budgeted reserve and we don't have to tap it, we only tap it if we need it. So we're still budgeting within our projected revenues. We're still being responsible in that regard. If I'm incorrect in that, perhaps I'm not.
You are absolutely correct.
Okay, so it's not like we're relying on that it's more of just a contingency as I understand it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is, at what level is it something we need to stabilize something? We've always had a stable budget process without ever touching the 15% reserve that we've had for years. Now, I think we upped it a little bit 4 or 5 years ago. It might not have been 15 before, maybe it was 10. It's always been 15. So we've never had to use the reserve except for maybe back in 2007 or 8. I think they dipped a little bit into it, if I remember right, during Alan Hanks's tenure, if I remember right. But anyway, so this makes me very nervous. We've never had to touch it since then. The economy has been very strong. Granted, this year has been a little challenging, but that's city government's job, is to make the necessary cuts, and the council support the staff in the areas where we need to make sure that we are matching expenditures with the actual revenues we get. May have not have been what we projected, but that's what we do. That's what families have to do. If they're not going to make as much as they'd hoped to make, they have to make cuts, and that's what we need to do. Government is not autonomous from the people. As many people might think that it is not. And so we're accountable to the people, and we need to run our business just like every family in this city does. So I'm a little nervous about this. I'm hoping you can give us something more concrete as we work through the budget process. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I'm going to go to Lisa Modrick, since Amanda's already spoken a couple times.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sean, I do have a question then from there. We're required by ordinance for the 15%. This is a new idea to bring a stability fund out of that 15 to make it the 7. In the ordinance, if we have another recession like we did back in 2008-9, are we able to hit that emergency fund if we absolutely need to, so that it's not sitting there with the thoughts in 5 or 6 or 10 years by council that is a contingency fund? Can it just stay where it's at, and are we able to dip into that if we need to?
As it currently reads,
If it stays as it is now?
the ordinance currently states that it's there, it's 15%, it's kind of frozen, and there are no mechanisms as to when and how you can decide on using those funds.
So in the ordinance, it doesn't specifically state what type of emergency?
No.
So if it's that open, can't we just adjust the ordinance so that it encompasses it under one fund, so we're not trying to manage 2 different funds at 8% and 7%, keep it at 15%?
That's an option.
Which is the current option now, just clean up the ordinance.
Add the stipulations as to when and how those funds can be used.
Do you know if because there's a requirement, I think, of 15%, I guess I need to know, can we use it for stability if we do have a fall in the economy? And maybe the mayor has that answer, because he seems to be ready for that one. Can you answer that, Mayor?
You can use the reserve whenever you choose to use it, for whatever you choose to use it. That money is there for the council to vote on and use. I think the point that of clarification, and what Sean's not telling you, is that he has analyzed this to some extent and found out that we don't do our reserve like most other people, or like the best practices would recommend. So dividing it into 2 in order to provide some stability and some emergency funding would allow, in the 2009 recession, to to help us be confident that we would not have to reduce services to the people during that recovery. So, and the policy was presented in this, with this intent, that this is a starting point. The council could talk about it and decide yes or no, we like it or we don't, and get somebody on it to bring a draft back in the next few days or week or whatever, and just kind of roll this around a little bit and see if it works. But I think the stability part of the reserve makes good sense. Now, as far as protecting future councils, you know how this works. So the next council can change the reserve ordinance and make it 20% or 5%. But we have an ordinance now that says 15. That's really, its usage is vague. So the disaster, and we're talking about under $20 million. So the disaster side of it would help us in another Winter Storm Atlas, help us with upfront costs of things we might even be getting reimbursed for. But the stability piece would prevent us from, in the worst case scenario, laying off employees in order to balance the budget. So that's for the consideration. It's for your consideration. And we'll cooperate and provide you with any drafts or anything that you would like to see. And if you don't like it at all, you don't have to.
So based on that, if we do have a downturn and we need to adjust stability, and it sounds like we would be doing it almost in emergency fashion, because if we see stability like we had a little bit this last spring, and if that trend continued, we would be reaching out to some kind of source to maintain, like you said, so that we don't lose employees and services because the city moves on. Would that have been an opportunity for the city, or would we have, I guess I'm kind of like Steve, I'm worried about
Sure.
the abuse of the stability program.
Under the proposed, so you can make the rules, and so if you want to restrict the stability part of the reserve to any time sales tax goes down below X percent of the last year or 2 years or whatever, then it can be used. If it goes down to, just a little under projected and it would be convenient to use it, I think you shouldn't allow the use of it. You should allow it to keep us out of a financial emergency, albeit temporary.
Doesn't our 15% work better if it's all in one interest fund?
It'll still be in one fund, but like I said, this is a best practice issue. We have a budget analyst with lots of experience and formal training who says there's a better way to do some things. So we're trying to offer that advice, and that's the point of presenting the draft ordinance.
I could ask one more question. Are there any other cities that perform their emergencies in their and a stability fund in order to protect their budgets?
I'll defer to Sean.
Yes. The majority of cities that we've reviewed have a formal policy that allows the usage of the fund for economic stability purposes.
So we'd be able to build a guideline off of
Yeah.
what's already been invented.
And actually,
when we're looking at this.
the draft that you have is based on a combination of the best practices from different cities.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Sean. And I'll go back, I'm going to go to Richie Nordstrom, he hasn't spoken on the subject yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of clarifications, 2 different points, and one in each area. The emergency reserve part, I understand what you're verbalizing as far as an example, but have you got something in mind for writing it up as a definition for an ordinance? Yet, what does an emergency mean? I know we can use Winter Storm Atlas as an example, but that's only one example, and I was just wondering if you had some concept of what that draft language would look like. What is an emergency?
The draft ordinance says it's a catastrophic event, but it can be clarified to include definition of an emergency. But the whole purpose of having the 7 to 10 or 2/3 majority of council votes is there just for that same purpose for the council to determine what that emergency is.
Thank you. And then going back to the stability reserve part of this, using as an example, and I'm still looking for a definition in the stability reserve, and I know the folks use the example of the Great Recession in 2007, 2008 as an example, but do you have a concept again for what does that, shall I say, the revenue is coming in at a severe shortfall, such as, so we don't use that as an example, because in a few years we're going to forget all about it, and then what is that definition?
Any regional or nationwide economic downturn would satisfy that definition, but as the ordinance or the proposed ordinance states, it's tied to a specific objective measure or metric such as the sales tax.
Thank you. I think I understand that. The other part of it is, say, for example, that the emergency reserve fund is depleted. We can still get into the stability reserve fund, so that if we do have a severe catastrophic event, that we could get into the stability fund?
It would be up to the council to decide.
Up to the council. Yeah. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Nordstrom. Back to Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mayor or Sean, either one of you, just some clarifying points for the council to consider. This draft of this reserve, none of the reserved is proposed to be used in the 2018 budget, so it's not something we have to have done in order to pass the 2018 budget, correct?
That's correct.
And then the other one is that the draft, such as you've mentioned, Mayor, basically you kind of threw this out for us to take a look at again. This can be a work in progress if the council even wants to go down this path. You just presented it so that we can kind of take a look at it and kind of reshuffle around those reserves.
I did present it for that purpose, but it's also timely with discussing the city's financial position and future, and it seems timely to have the discussion now, but you're welcome to put it off until whenever you choose.
Well, I wasn't suggesting that. I was just trying to make sure that the 2018 budget is not contingent upon us looking at this reserve draft at this time.
That's correct.
Okay. So thank you. And then the 2 points, and I had mentioned them, but I just want to kind of stress them. The 2 points in there, as Alderman Laurenti had said, he's looking at the replenishment plan. My concern is that I believe the way the reserve lines are now is that it requires a vote of 2/3 of the council because it's basically spending money. And is that correct? That if we wanted to spend anything out of the reserve today, it would take appropriation of fund, a 2/3 vote of the council on any of that 15%. Is that correct?
I believe that's the way your policy is set up today.
Yes. So what's proposed in this draft is that the crisis portion of it would require a 2/3 vote. I may have this backwards, but the stability portion only requires a majority vote. So one of my questions would be, if we're looking at that, is if our procedures for the council and our policy for the council is that it requires 2/3 vote to spend money or to, obligate the city to spend money. I'm not so sure that one we should really take down to a majority vote. I just wanted to throw that out, that if we are going to take a look at this in the future, I don't know if I'd really separate out to a majority of vote to dip in, because you're still spending funds at that point. But so thank you. Just wanted to clarify, we don't have to really have this in place to go forward with our 2018 budget, but I agree it's probably something that we need to try to take a look at. And I do appreciate Alderman Laurenti's suggestion of potentially looking at a plan to be drafted into this ordinance so that it's kind of a step 1, step 2, step 3 if we actually have to vote on anything. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, up next, any more discussion on the general fund reserve policy? Okay, we're going to move on to discussion of proposed general fund and spending. Anybody has any questions or comments about that particular item? Discussion of 2018 proposed general fund spending. So just a general discussion of the proposed spending of the general fund, and here we have Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mayor, if you don't mind, I'm going to pose a question that I think we already have the answer, but I just wanted clarification on it. I was quite concerned to see the Parks and Rec Department jump 23%, because I was prepared to ask, what in the world are we doing with our Parks and Rec Department for it to increase 23%? But now that I look at the actual dollars, I am asking you for clarification that this is the expenses of those enterprise funds that we put into the general fund that's being offset by the 2 million goods and services? Is that correct?
While I look for it, see if Pauline's got the shortcut.
I think she's looking it up here, but I'm just looking at the revenue versus the expense side, and since I wrote down those notes on the enterprise funds, my guess is that the $2 million in expenses is...
There's several different organizational codes in parks, and so can you clarify by chance which one you're looking at?
This was just what you presented as far as in your slides, so it just... The amount you presented for Parks and Rec is 9.1 or almost $9.2 million for 2018, and what you presented in 2017 budget was 7.5%. So it's
Well, in there now is the last year was the cemeteries, and this year was the golf courses.
okay, and that's what I was asking. So it's the expenses that are being offset by the revenue increase in the goods and services on the revenue side.
Yes.
Okay. So, Mayor, and I don't know if you said so in your presentation, but one of the things of keeping those enterprise funds, because you had mentioned that the city's huge dependency on sales tax needs to be re-diversified, like a well-rounded portfolio. If we're putting the enterprise funds into the general fund for these departments, and we're looking at those fees, what is the method now that are going to be able to be evaluated to see if we're lopsided on the expense versus the revenue on the cemetery and the golf courses and those types of, because I think that's why they were enterprise funds to start with.
Well, they were enterprise funds because they were intended to make money. They were taken out because they required annual subsidies from general fund, but we still account for the revenue from all of the departments, general fund or otherwise. And so we'll be able to see what they're bringing back into the budget. And it could be, we just didn't have the guts to do it this time, but it could be on this spreadsheet that you're looking at, that we go back department by department and add in the revenue that's brought in by that department. I understand it used to be that way one day back in the old days, and it was changed. Pauline might nod to that, but she doesn't know. Anyway, we'd had some brief conversation about it to make it easier to understand.
And would that potentially help the different departments and the department directors try to get a good handle on what they actually should be charging? Because I understand that there's a certain amount of fees that you can charge that the market will bear, that our citizens will bear. But then there's a portion of it where you're actually supposed to be looking at what does it actually cost us to provide this? And then we really should be setting those fees and those licenses at the actual cost it's costing the city to perform those duties, correct?
Correct, for some of those services. So like a golf course would be different, for example, than a fire department or street cleaning division or one of those things. But for all the rates and fees, I believe, should be evaluated. And I'm not saying necessarily raised, but should be evaluated for relevancy every couple of years at the most. And what we're lacking here is a clear policy on doing that type of thing. But I understand your question, I believe, and the assurance is that we're always going to track the revenue for those specific things and be able to articulate it when necessary.
Okay, thank you. I see Alderman Laurenti's in the queue, so I'll let him go ahead and talk, and I'll come back. Thank you.
Mr. Laurenti.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor, if I may, because my question is about the same as well, I had that one written down. What was it that in your opinion, that the budget, the city, if you will, the taxpayers ultimately stand to gain by moving the cemetery and the golf courses to the general fund from enterprise funds? What was the the overarching thinking on that? Where's the advantage? What is the advantage there?
Well, primarily, they don't meet the definition of an enterprise fund in terms of self-sustainability. They more resemble a general fund department than an enterprise fund. The taxpayer wouldn't notice a difference in the level of services, although with the cemetery, we have, over the years, handled a number of complaints about maintenance out there. And when we moved the cemetery over into the general fund, we found out that they, in order to keep their balance sheet in good shape, they were not purchasing equipment, did not have a purchase replacement or equipment replacement plan. And so for the first time, perhaps, they have articulated a plan, and we are implementing that in smaller steps because it goes from 30-year-old equipment cobbled together to something a little more reasonable. And so that would be the one thing. But
so on that particular note, because you talked about the valuation of assessed fees, that's not baked into this budget that you're projecting. There wasn't some huge reassessment of fees across the board baked into this budget, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
I was proposing that we do that and have that information ready around the end of the year for your consideration,
Right.
But nothing more.
Okay, that's what I thought I had heard you say, and I'm glad to hear that because I think we are way behind the ball on that one. And I think to these funds, I guess what I'm still not understanding is why, because when they are enterprise funds, they have to pay for themselves. Now I know, and you know as well, that both of these, well, I'm going to hold back on the cemetery, but I know that the maintenance necessary to keep that, I mean, we had to have funds raised separately. Mr. Wright went out trying to raise funds privately to get some stones re-leveled, if you will. So I'm hoping that what happens here, and I know that we have subsidized the golf courses multiple times. Now, granted, some of that was the way that the restaurant was being run. We tried to take that out of private hands and run it ourselves, which was a huge mistake. But I'm hoping that that gets looked at because the golf course, from my understanding, and I have dealt with many of the different golf courses in town, they believe that this golf course undercuts the basic supply and demand, the ability for the other golf courses to, well, they're operating on very slim budgets because they have to compete with a government-run 18-hole golf course. And so I'm hoping that that reassessment comes sooner for at least the golf course because I know that we have subsidized this multiple times out of the general fund. And I'm hoping, and that's one of the questions I'd like to have at the next, if I can, Pauline, is if there was a profit or did we subsidize it again this last budget year, the golf course fund. So that would be nice to know. So I'm hoping, I think you're making the right steps on this, but I guess I don't understand why moving it to the general fund makes it better. Because we are wanting to, the big fix is to assess that golf course's ability to pay for itself, stay up on its maintenance, buy the necessary maintenance things that both the golf course and the cemetery need, and adjust their fees accordingly so that council doesn't have to go out and try to raise funds privately just to try to get some headstones leveled that aren't being taken care of anymore. So.
Right. I appreciate the comments, and I'm going to get that put into a question for Parks Director Jeff Beegler, who will then respond to you and the rest of the council with those rates. My understanding is that there's been a rate study of the other golf courses, and that Rapid City's Meadowbrook Golf Course falls in the middle of that group. We have done an very informal rate study on the cemetery by calling around to a few people and found that we're higher than some. I don't know if we were lower than any, but just as a FYI, with the cemetery, they dig about 110 or so graves a year, and the taxpayers subsidize each grave about $2,000. So there's an opportunity for us to look at privatization or other options, because this is not a very sustainable thing. And if you were to leave these departments in the enterprise fund, then one of their revenue sources over time, and it would be increasing over time, would be general fund supplement. And I don't think that's any better. That's just a matter of where your books are kept, and we could present their revenue at any time in the general fund.
Okay, no, I appreciate your comments on that, because I know that we have had to subsidize both of them, and that's obviously a reflection of the fact that fees have not been assessed correctly, and we have debated that a few times on the golf course, that they are not charging appropriately. Whether they're in the middle or not, I don't much care about that. The reality is that the golf course needs to take care of itself, or maybe we need to look at other options. If they need to be in the upper compared to the other 18-hole golf courses to keep the taxpayers from having to subsidize them every year, then they need to be in the upper crust of charging fees that high. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So it's not something the taxpayers should subsidize at any level. And maybe ultimately, as you said, Mayor, we might need to entertain privatization, selling these assets off that the government never belonged in the first place. Thank you.
And we go to Alderwoman Darla Drew, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in thinking about this conversation right now, we seem to subsidize a lot of sports in this town, so I don't think that the golf course should actually be singled out as something that is somehow a burden. I'd also like to say that that land is different because it was from the flood, and to me that's land that needs to be protected, and it needs to remain in the city purview. I don't want to see it sold off to another golf course to come in and use it. This was the citizens that gave up their homes, sometimes their lives in that area. You know, they wanted it to go to the public use. And so I think it's something that we have to do to be respectful to what happened in 1972 to those people in their homes and their livelihoods that happened in this community, and we have to respect that and keep that area. To me, it's kind of sacred. I was here during the flood, so it's different for me. So I want to keep it in city hands. I guess maybe if we have to increase some of the fees, I'm not really sure about golf course fees, but I know that there's a lot of people in our area that enjoy it. A lot of the older, more senior citizens of our community really enjoy that course, and I hope that we can keep it within affordability levels. As far as the cemeteries go, I think that what we're not thinking about is future uses, because as we look at trends, actual burials rates are going down. People are opting for cremation. In some areas, even in Sioux Falls, they have organic burial. So those are some things that we might want to look at, think about when we're looking at the Parks Department and planning for the future, that we might not need as much space as we think we do. We might not need the kind of maintenance that we think we do. And so I think that those are all things that we really, when we're looking at the big picture, things are changing, and the millennials are changing it for us all. So they will be making different choices, I'm sure, with their remains. So that's it. Thank you.
If I might interject one point, the baby boomers are the ones going to be using the cemetery a lot faster than the millennials, and there's a lot more of them.
I know that's true, but when millennials get to our age, I think they might make different choices. And I think even the baby boomers are going to make different choices.
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to Rich Nordstrom, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're on general fund spending, correct? Mayor, I'm looking at this slide that you have as titled General Fund Budget, and what I'm seeing on there is mostly the drivers that you're referring to. And a couple of items on here to start with is the new FTEs. We're talking about 5 FTEs to start with, and I think you explained it fairly well, but would you do it again to explain why we are going with 3 to 4 HR FTEs?
For the HR potential additions of full-time employees, We are in a reorganization phase. We have, over the past year or so, come to understand many of our weaknesses in the city administration, and that essential service has really been neglected over the years. We have just a small handful of employees there for almost 800 full-time employees and 1,100 or 1,800 part-time employees. We have an obligation to provide services that we're not providing. And a very important service that we need to provide is being able to account for time and pay employees correctly. Many of our errors in this function of HR has been in payroll. And so we are and have been investigating how to overcome this issue. We've had an audit from a private firm giving us direction on the payroll side. And I'm anticipating that there will need to be a buildup in HR. But today, and especially when I made this presentation, we do not have a formula at this point. We have a wild guess about how many employees may be needed or how many we can realistically add in 2018 to help address this problem. We might find out that one employee does wonders or two employees. So I've put funding in this budget for up to 4 mid-level employees or 2 mid-level and a higher level employee in HR.
Primarily what I'm concerned about, and I thank you for the answer, is very, very clear. One of the concerns that I have on this is that I'll use the word redundancy in the financial or the payroll system. It seems like for years we've only had one employee in doing payroll. So are you anticipating one of these FTEs becoming, I'll use the word redundancy for payroll?
Yes, we have an opening in HR, an HR specialist role, and we have converted that job description. You just approved that at one of the last council meetings, and we've made a job offer for that job, and that will be a payroll-related employee that will specifically be there to bolster our payroll capabilities.
Thank
Does that
you.
answer your question?
It does. And just to be clear for my colleagues is to understand, gosh, I remember being an employee and only one employee in the HR was doing the payroll, and she was doing everything from A to Z as far as handling the payroll. And when she went on vacation, the work piled up on her desk. And there was really no other person that really could adequately take care of that. And so I'm very supportive of this idea of putting a redundant position in this department. The other part that raises concerns for me is item number 1 is the personnel costs, mainly in wage increases. I know you expressed some concerns about the annual increases for the employees, but what I would caution you about is, or re-examine or get another opinion on the Condrey study. That's been very effective, been a very useful tool to use as an evaluator within our city. And I haven't got enough data yet presented to me yet as far as how that tool is becoming available or useful to have a reduction in turnover of employees. And I refer to mostly the police department used to have a very high turnover. Now I'm starting to see that trend reverse. Am I correct saying that we're starting to see a downward trend in the number of employee turnover? Because it gets very expensive when we start putting in new employees and retraining and et cetera.
I can't answer that accurately, but I'll say it doesn't really seem like it. If it is, it's very minor at this point.
Thank you. The Parks and Rec has been pretty well covered, so I don't need to add anything more to that. And I'm hoping to look forward to the last bullet point that you've expressed on here is the central services and the PILT or the PILT. So that's coming up, so thank you. Yield.
Stay tuned. Up next, Amanda Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mayor, just to finish off the questions I have as far as the funding, or the funding of the, the general fund expenses, is overall last year, you increased the budget 7% from the 2016 year. And a lot of those drivers, I think last year when you presented, were based on a lot of FTEs that were needed, because as you said, you're evaluating the organization throughout. It just, I guess, here's the bottom line question. Because you had proposed that we would have to shuffle some employees, that some departments would be over, some would be under. We may not necessarily lose FTEs, but it would be a shuffling. But we did add, if my memory serves me correctly, about 21 FTEs last year. You're proposing 4 more this year. What have your efforts done on the shuffling side of this? Anything?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by
Okay,
the
so
shuffling.
you said when you were looking at the budget, because I had questioned last year the increases, and primarily the driving force for city budgets is wages and benefits. And one of the questions that I had posed last year is if you were including all of these new FTEs, what I thought the driver that you said when you first came into office 3 years ago was you were going to look at the city and see where there were some heavy FTEs in some departments versus some departments that were light versus some that we would probably have to rehire, but there was a potential of actually reducing. And so far, I think in the 3 years you've been in office, there has been no reduction in FTEs.
Okay, well, you're giving me too much credit because I've only been here 2 years.
Okay.
But, there has been a couple of transfers of FTE positions from other departments to departments in need. And that has been because of an opening in the original department, reassessment of job tasks and that sort of thing, and an overall determination that filling that position wasn't necessary. So we transferred that FTE position to another department that was in need, and that's been done without going back and asking and confirming. It's been done at least twice that I know of.
All right. And so are you still in your evaluation, or are you pretty much resigned to the fact that the city of Rapid City needs to increase FTEs over the next few years?
Well, I can't really say over the next few years. I just know that for 2018 we have a need in HR, but I can't say specifically. No department director really comes and says we have way too many people working here. So it's a matter of duties and programs, and we're infants in priority-based budgeting. We've got all kinds of articulated programs, and we may come to determine that we need to stop offering some services that are lightly used or unpopular or outdated and take that employee time, which sometimes comes in small increments like 0.2 FTEs or 0.18 FTEs and so on. And when those come to a point where it's a full or a half person, then maybe make those adjustments. So that is, we're still in that evaluation. I have no conclusions about the proper number of FTEs citywide.
Okay. So it looks like the overall general fund budget last year was increased 7%, and there really, I mean, besides the cemeteries last year, there really was no reshuffling of enterprise separate entities into the general fund or that type of stuff. So this year, taking out those enterprise funds that were put into the general fund, it still has an overall increase in spending of 4%. So is that additional 4% spending in the general fund due to primarily wages, or is there something else driving it?
Well, it's in large part wages, but other things that affect the general fund are bringing golf over.
Yeah, I subtracted those.
Okay. Then yeah, I mean there are some substantial wage adjustments in 2018 that are approved union contracts. And now the good news is 2 of the unions have restructured their pay scale so they have fewer steps. But in 18, there are substantial increases.
So the primary, and I'm just trying to summarize, so the primary driving force of this 4% additional increase over the 7% from last year is wages and benefits?
Yes. There are some odds and ends things. For example, the GIS division is due to have new aerial photography done for mapping purposes. So usually we spend nothing on that service, and this year it's $120,000, or next year $120,000. So there's some of those type of things, but generally speaking, it's wages and benefits.
Okay. Then with that said, the only other question I really have on here, and you may have already answered it, but I'm just trying to confirm them. The police department's budget went up 5%, but the fire department's went up 11%. Is the fire department's 11% increase all wages and driven?
No, I can't say that. I don't know if I'll be able to scroll through the 8 or 10 organizational codes and come to that determination right now.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I have the Chief Financial Officer who may have a potential answer on that.
By all means.
While there are significant raises due to the union contract negotiations with the fire folks, also in 2018, you will see for the first time where the airport firefighters are actually being paid out of the general fund. The offsetting revenue was that $558,000 that Ms. Scott talked about earlier. So there was about a $558,000 amount added to their expenditures for that contract to fall under the general fund.
And thank you. So if that helps, Mayor, because that's the part, even though I wrote it down over here, and I got it for the Parks and Rec, I totally missed that in the fire, that the Chief Financial Officer did say that there was that $550,000, and so those expenses would be offset and part of that increase on the spending side. So thank you, Pauline, for clearing that up a little bit. So I guess, well, it says general fund, and I believe the other one is, so I'll just make this comment and then we'll move on because I'm sure we're going to come back to it anyways. But I have a hard time trying to cut out any of our other expenses when I see increases in the general fund overall. It's kind of hard to drop $184,000 because that seems like such a pittance compared to $4 million that the general fund is going up. So more on that conversation to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. And just as a point of order, once again, Alderwoman Modrick has graciously decided to record all the questions you might have. So anything after the meeting, if you please, as we go, she'll be recording those for me. Yeah, and so going back to Steve Laurenti.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to, since she quickly said it, Alderwoman Scott, I appreciate those comments because you know what we're dealing with here in this general fund, and I'm hoping, I just wanted to clarify because I think we had some conversation after the last meeting after the mayor's presentation about a resolution for the CPI. It is my understanding, and I know that we did not rescind that resolution, that we will have that coming forward as well, that there will be a separate vote to take that CPI since, as we all know, there is one built into the budget. So I want to make sure that that is brought forth by staff as well before we pass this budget. I believe that's when it's supposed to be done. Is that correct, Joel?
Excuse me?
If you would, please. The resolution that requires a separate vote by the council to take any property tax increase, does it have to be passed before the budget is passed? Or is there a...
Yes, according to the resolution, a resolution of intent to take the CPI has to be approved prior to final adoption, which would be approval of second reading of the appropriation ordinance.
Okay, and I just wanted to, I guess, add some comment to that particular item because my colleagues have these figures in front of them, and I'm hoping that you go over them in detail on the actual revenue increases that the city has seen since 2006. Is kind of the benchmark that the mayor started with in his presentation. If you use those numbers from 2006 through the 2016 revenue streams, we have averaged, combining both property and sales tax, we've averaged 4.5% growth each year. 4.5% growth. and we're still taking a CPI increase. We're going to take a property tax increase regardless. I mean, with all of that, we're still going to take another $161,000 from the taxpayers, even though we're experiencing 4.5% growth in revenues every year. We've increased our revenues over those from 2006 to 2016, a total of over $23 million, and yet we still want to increase taxes on the taxpayers. So I'm hoping my colleagues will look at that, study that, and really think hard about whether we need to increase taxes. And remember, these increases, these CPI increases are in perpetuity. They're not just for 1 year. That property tax increase is going to come from the taxpayers. That increase is going to come from them every year in perpetuity. It's not just for the next budget year. So it's $161,000 this year. It's over $1 million in 10 years, right? It's $1.6 million. So we really need to think about that seriously. It is a small amount, which also means that it's a small amount that we can find in the budget to decrease, so that we don't pass that tax increase on to the taxpayers forever. And I think that we can find a way to do that, knowing that we average 4.5% growth in our tax revenues every year since 2006. There should be a way for us to find a way to do that, because our taxpayers, the people out there earning that median income of, what is it, about $41,000, $42,000 here in Rapid City, and a lot of those people are two-income people working in retail just to get to that average median income here in Rapid City. If they got a 4.5% increase every year, they'd be unbelievably happy. And so we need to find a way to do without taking additional property taxes from the taxpayers, from the wage earners, so that they can keep that money in their pockets. If we can't find a way to trim out $161,000 out of this budget, I'll tell you what, we need to probably find some new council people, and I'd be glad to go too. But I'm going to be on the side of finding a way to do it. We just have to have the will to find the cuts in this budget, and I believe if we can't find that, then we're in trouble.
Okay, we're still talking about general fund revenue spending. Amanda? No, Amanda, excuse me, Darla?
Well, thank you.
So,
Considering the CPI, I would like to ask Pauline Sumption a question, please.
sure.
Can you tell us what happened with the CPI funding last year?
There was no CPI last year, so there was no decision to be made. The cost of living, according to the census, was negative, so.
Okay, thank you. So there was nothing. However, if we did go forward with this and got $161,000, that would probably fund the cuts that that we as a council are hearing the most about, cuts to RSVP, the Journey, and the Allied Arts Fund. $161,000 would be a good way to fund those cuts and make a lot of our citizens very happy. Thank you.
Back to Amanda. General fund expenditures.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then since this conversation went about the general fund expense side of it and be an offset, I just want to remind everyone that the 2017 budget was balanced when it was passed by City Council last year with $3.5 million of undesignated cash. This year, we're looking at a 2018 budget that, even though we're showing all of these revenue increases, it's still proposed to be balanced as presented by the mayor with $1.3 million. Now granted, as the mayor stated, it is less than last year, but it is still dipping into the undesignated cash. And to me, if government's going to be responsible, we really should not be dipping into cash. We should be looking at the revenue streams and balancing the budget based on the revenue that is anticipated to come in, which means really we should be looking at reducing this budget $1.3 million additional besides the 184 the mayor already cut out. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, no further discussion on that topic. We're going to move on to discussion of personnel costs and full-time employee additions and central services cost allocation. So we've kind of covered a few of that a couple times here. I allowed that just because it's pretty informal up here. Imagine us sitting around a big conference table. So anyway, does anybody want to talk about any of those particular items? And I'm going to go with Amanda Scott, maybe.
I keep waiting for someone else to beat me to the punch here. So the only question I have, and Mayor, if you wouldn't mind, I think Sean is more, unless you want to handle this, I think Sean has a better handle on this, or at least that's who provided the answer to my question. But Sean, basically you developed a formula for the central services cost allocation, and this is part of the interdepartmental charges out to the enterprise funds for those services that are provided by general fund departments. My main question to you, and the formula is there, and I think it's attached, but my main question to you is besides the central services cost allocation back out, are the other interdepartmental charges more realistic to those services that are actually incurred by those enterprise funds in the 2018 budget? Because in the past, it's always been well, I don't really know.
It's unknown at this point.
So they were reviewed, the enterprise funds are being charged for those services.
The actual interdepartmental charges, that is the charges from one department to another, have not been reviewed.
They have not.
Only the central service costs.
Okay, all right, thank you, because I thought all of them had been reviewed. So that still leaves me a little concerned. Just, Mayor, just so you're aware, and you are aware, because I had this conversation with you last year as well, is that I know city councils, as well as mayors in the past, there was some logic to the interdepartmental charges that were being charged to the other departments for those specific services, not the central service cost allocation. I think Sean did an excellent job trying to come up with some logic behind the central costs and being reallocated back out. But I still am really, really concerned that we don't have a really good answer to all of our enterprise funds as far as what they're being charged for the services provided. I know that, again, like I'll say, city councils as well as mayors in the past have kind of said, well, we need a revenue stream, so let's just increase the interdepartmental charges by 10%. So I really would stress appreciation of having those reviewed for the 2019 budget and see if we can at least have some logic and some, I mean, it may be those are the actual cost. I'm not comfortable looking at the enterprise fund saying, by the way, hand me some money for the general fund, and I really don't have a good answer as to why you're paying it. It just doesn't sit well with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Just 1 second, if I could jump back to the general fund spending, just for a quick clarification that for the public's knowledge, that no money was appropriated to the golf courses last year for additional monies. It was all done through developmental fees from the Meadowbrook and executive course. So I'll make sure that's on the record, as people understanding that, and we can clarify that later. But moving on to Steve Laurenti, back to discussion of personnel costs and full-time employee additions and central services cost allocation.
Well, that's good to hear, Chair, on the no subsidy for those. That's good to hear. Two questions, one for the Mayor, if I may, and then one for Sean, if I may as well. Mayor, you talked about in the presentation about these maybe bad decisions that the city made before, and it's been for years. And I know there's a lot of things that you're tackling, and I think you're getting some traction on some of the things, so I appreciate that. My question is some of the comments that you made about contracts that the city had put themselves into that had guaranteed increases. If you could speak about that, is this 2018 budget making any headway in that, or what do you see as the plan for the city? This may be not germane because it might not have anything to do with the 2018 budget, but if it does, if you could speak about that, and then what your plan is as a substitute, if you will, or how we would change that.
Sure. Well, the change will have to be a longer-term change. The police and fire unions allow an reopener for wages under some certain circumstances or time frames, but we have signed, all of us here have signed multiple year contracts without knowing what the revenues will be in coming years. And in contrast to that, Pennington County looks at their revenues before they utter anything about wage increases. And so I know that kind of runs afoul of the interest-based bargaining and all that type of thing, but I think the multiple year contracts are so convenient because negotiating and going through contracts can be excruciating, but I think we've done a disservice to ourselves. That we ought to put ourselves on a path of having single-year contracts that have a real calculation, a real-world calculation of our revenues and how much is available for wages, and it ought to be driven more by the city based on a real mathematical equation.
So, which I like. I agree with you. I think it's folly for us to do that without knowing what can happen 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, to lock the city into spending certain revenues that they don't even know that they may not see, and what to do if that happens. Hopefully, collective bargaining goes the other way as well. The city, but I do agree with you. Do you see a potential issue of litigation where by these different unions, because the city isn't participating in this collective bargaining, which they've always done for decades? Do you see a potential there?
Well, we would still be participating in bargaining, and it's more interest-based bargaining now, but we'll still be negotiating. But you cannot negotiate, you can't be willing to give something you don't have. And one of these contracts that we signed has a 1-year increase in there that said the employees will receive 1% increase regardless of sales tax revenue. And so my assessment of this is that if the wages and benefits continue to go up but the revenue doesn't, then we're going to have a forced cannibalization scenario here where the departments have to grow at their own expense. At the expense of equipment, at the expense of employees, at the expense of all of the things that they need to do their jobs. And that's a very unhealthy scenario to talk about. So getting a grip on it and being able to have a realistic discussion about revenues and what can be made available for wages is very important. I'm for good wages.
Right.
But this is, we're looking at, big increases in
Pardon my interruption, gentlemen. The city attorney would like to jump in. I want to make sure we're not talking about anything we shouldn't be talking about.
Yeah. Well, it is a little complicated because we are in currently negotiations with AFSCME for their contract. So I don't want to have a negotiation up here. And this is frankly a lot more complicated. There's 2 sides to it. Yeah, it's easy to say, well, we don't know what the upcoming revenue is going to be, so how can we lock in? I'm not sure exactly what the county's situation is, but based on what I've seen, where they kind of just every year decide what the increase is, my guess is they're not unionized. So they have the ability to do that. Because our employees are unionized, and that isn't something that is a unilateral choice on our part, that is something that under state law they're allowed to do and they've done, we have to negotiate with them the salary increases. There is efficiency and economy in negotiating multi-year contracts, because if we have to enter into negotiations with the negotiation team every single year for wages, it is going to delay that process and complicate it. However, you would have a better handle of what budgetarily you could afford. There's a lot of things that go into consideration of wages other than just revenues, and I will use as an example that increase. Part of the problem we had, and Alderman Nordstrom mentioned it earlier, was recruiting and retaining police officers. We had gotten to a point where our starting salary was less than that of Box Elder, and that was not a good situation to be in. So not only were the union pushing for increased salaries, but the administration of the police department was, because they were watching their force lose experience and spending time and training people, and they were losing those people. Once they got their foot in the door and they got some training, they went to some place with a higher wage. I would suggest talking to Chief Jagras about what his view of the increased salary is. But honestly, the contract for the police department was driven by a desire to improve recruitment and retention, and so we were competitive. And that is why it wasn't tied to sales tax, because that's the way it had been written before, and frankly, it hadn't kept pace. And that's how we got so far behind, and then we had to give larger increases, not only to get to where we need to be, but all the catch-up So again, it's very complicated. There's a lot that goes into that. And I will just say that the finance officer and I have a meeting with the mayor on Monday afternoon to discuss some of this. So I don't know that we want to get really into the meat of this right now. And frankly, there's some bigger philosophical things that need to be considered when we decide in the future how we're going to proceed on negotiations.
Thank you. And no, by all means, I was thinking 30,000-foot level in those questions. So especially, yeah, I'm not wanting to get into the weeds at all. That is none of my concern at this point. So thank you. Sean, if you would, please. My question to you has to do with, and maybe the mayor can chime in on this as well, but Alderwoman Scott brought it up, and it was one of my questions as well for this area about the valuation of interdepartmental charges. I'm a little dumbfounded about this because we've been dealing with this for quite a few years, and it doesn't feel like we get a lot of traction. My question to you is, in this current budget, did we look at, I'll just use the attorney's office as an example for my question. The attorney's office has a certain amount of expense. All their wages, their benefits, all that added up, all of their supplies, all of it added up is whatever it is. I assume that we know that. So we could calculate in a full-time position or a full-time 2,080 hours. I don't know what the value, how you would do it. I'm just thinking off the top of my head why we're having problems with getting a real good valuation of interdepartmental charges. We know that there are fixed expenses, total of that for the year. And so per hour, whatever number of hours, working hours there are in a year, which a full-time employee is 2080, we would divide those expenses out and we would have a figure. This is how much it is per hour to employ the attorney's office. Is the valuation much more complicated than that?
No, that's exactly what has been done.
So in this budget today, in the 2018 projected budget, the interdepartmental charges for the attorney's office is based on that calculation.
Based on the estimates of how much time they devote to each of them.
Correct. That's the unknown. But the reality is if they estimate 4,000 hours of work and they do 3,700 hours of work, then there's going to be a surplus in your budget. Am I correct? Would there not be a surplus in their budget? If they project their budget on 4,000 hours of work for all of the other departments and they only do 3,500 hours for all the other departments, their budget is now smaller than what we projected it at.
And when those estimates were requested, the request was to look at a typical year.
Okay. If you would,
I
Joel.
don't know if it actually works that way, and I'll give you an example. When I looked at the program cost for, say, the Human Relations Commission, I want to say it was like $35,000. So if you cut that program, you're not going to save $35,000 unless I fire staff, because that staff time is just going to be dedicated to something else. So to give you an example, when you look at my budget, I want to say it's in the $700,000 range. $75,000 of that is supplies, equipment, travel.
Right.
So the rest is staff. So to actually cut the budget or reduce the amount that my office costs, you're going to have to cut staff.
So this is my question. Per your example, you're saying that if you're dedicating a lot of hours to something and we cut it, that doesn't necessarily shrink your budget.
No.
Well, what would they be doing? If 1,000 hours of your staff is based on doing work for that group, what would they be doing otherwise?
Well, theoretically, if you cut enough stuff, then that would reduce the demand for services at the attorney's office and may justify a reduction in staff. The problem is where that line is, and are you going to know? I mean, you cut staff, you're going to have a lower level of service. So either you cut programs so there's less demand, or that is just going to be absorbed where other areas where right now maybe we're not providing the level of service that's required, we would just increase that time in those areas for the level of service.
So does your office keep track of the number of hours that it bills, like an attorney's office would?
No, when I did purchase several years ago law office management software, we did intentionally purchase one that has that capability. It has been discussed from time to time. You know, the problem for budgeting purposes is where our time is dedicated fluctuates so much from year to year. I mean, it's not stable. We did provide an overall level that we thought of time that we spent in various departments to Sean to do the calculation. But to some degree, that was a guess. It was an educated guess based on, you know, our experience and a sense of how much time we spend on each department. But take the Civic Center, for example. It would be tough for them to budget for legal fees every year because some years we spend a lot of time providing, and other years we wouldn't spend any, so they'd budget a lot of money and then that wouldn't be used, or vice versa. They'd get hit with
I get that. Unseen litigation. I am familiar with that, obviously, with the number of executive sessions we have with that particular issue. I understand that. It just seems to me that again, I just feel like we're missing something, and I think it's because it does your office, and I'm not picking on your office, I just want you to understand that wherever these interdepartmental charges are, that we've got to be somehow, I just don't understand it, because the civilian world does this all the time. They do interdepartmental charges. So, and it's very finite. And I don't understand why government is different, because your costs are like their costs, wages and benefits. They have the same issues. You have legal teams in private firms that survive on interdepartmental charges, and it's never an issue figuring out what their cost is per hour, at least from my experience. And so I'm having a really hard time understanding why we cannot pin down the cost of interdepartmental charges for city government. I just don't understand it. And I still don't understand it, and I'm going to keep questioning, and I'm hoping my colleagues do as well. This is a lot of money, and it's not for your department. It's accountability. We cannot tell the taxpayers why that we're spending $700,000 on your department. Granted, your department does a ton of work. I know that. But what I would like to be able to do as an elected official is say, this $700,000 pays for X number of hours, and they have X number of staff because they have X number of hours that they bill. And so we need a system. You need a system, a billing system, as laborsome as it might be, but I can't imagine that it would, because we have such good software companies out there now that can provide a billing system that your people can log their hours for whatever department they're doing work for, and we can start pinning this down better. We just have to do a better job. That's bottom line, in my opinion, but I yield.
I think, Mr. Laurenti, we'll be getting farther into the interdepartmental charges, probably a little farther along here, but everybody, yeah. So get your popcorn ready. And there's a couple of folks that came in late. It was pointed out to me. Just so you know, folks, we're not taking public comment at this time. This is basically just us sitting around discussing the budget, getting our information that we need to get from the various sources, and discussing amongst ourselves so we understand more about what's going on and how it's being spent. So just so you understand that, we're not trying to take away anybody's right to talk or comment on their budget. Just we want to make sure we know what we're talking about before we start voting and making decisions that affect everybody around here. It's $160 million, so thank you. I'm going to go with that. I'm going to go back to Richie Nordstrom, and we're still on discussion of central services at cost allocation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the reminder, as well as some of these central service costs. And in the previous discussion, we had a little short comment about the union contracts and how that's being affected. I want to caution the council to be very careful when you start talking in that area, because it doesn't take much to trigger an unfair labor practice, and it doesn't take much to for any one of our unions, one of four, to put together an unfair labor practice, and then we have to defend that position, and it usually winds up at the Department of Labor. So I'll caution you about talking about specifics within a contract or even touching on issues with an unfair labor practice. It's a very dangerous area to go into, so if we can further avoid that. Mr. Chair, a couple of questions on the central services. I I am agreeing with Alderman Laurenti about understanding how that cost is derived at. The very much of a concern is that how do we know how much is being allocated towards what other department or other division? And if I may ask the city finance officer a question about the Tyler program, do we have a module that could be added on so that when the human resources does work for a division or a department, they do a time clock or whatever they call it nowadays for allocating time? Or how does can that be done? I understand we've got software out there in the private enterprise, but can that be available for a government entity?
I'd have to look. I know that right now, anybody that has a time card system within their department, Jim Gilbert has had to write some conversion.
Software code?
Yeah, to be able to import it into our system. Others, we just enter time into the employee self-service. So an hourly employee just puts how many number of hours that they worked, unless it would be a payroll nightmare if you wanted them to go in every day, and especially with, I'm going to take our department, for instance, our receipts or our payables. Anytime somebody enters a receipt, they may have to put in a different code. That would be a nightmare, quite frankly. And so a lot of times we go off of estimates. You know, Joel talked about looking back. I believe they looked at a 5-year estimate of what a typical year would look like and how much time, trying to even it out to keep it stable so it is easier for the other departments to budget each. I honestly don't know if they have that module in and of itself, but what we have currently in use, it would just be horrendous to even maintain or utilize in that manner.
In other words, it's going to take a lot more research into doing this. Because what I'm coming from is that I know how busy you folks are, and you've got a plate full, and we need to build sideboards on a lot of people with their plates. So the concern that I have is that you're working on a project, you get a telephone call with a different question or a different subject that needs to be addressed, and I can just only imagine you putting the timesheet into the clock and saying, well, this is where my project started and stopped, and then I'm starting up and stopping on this next project. So I can only imagine what kind of a nightmare that's
I
going
worked
to
in a
produce.
CPA firm before I ever came into public government, where we had to bill our time to our clients, and literally we were down to, you keep track of every 6 minutes. If you walk down to the bathroom, you have to write down that you went down to the bathroom. If you went to lunch, you have to write that out. If you spent 5 minutes on somebody, you round it up to 6 minutes. I mean, it's not fun in private industry. And with as much as we have going on in the city, like I said, with our accounts payable staff or our accounts receivable staff, anytime somebody comes up to our window, it could be for a different purpose. And it would be, okay, 1 minute here. Or with invoices, there may be multiple departments or divisions on one invoice, and how do you separate that out with your time? And honestly, it's not feasible in those cases. Now, I don't know if it's any better in an attorney's office. My guess is not much, and when we have all this stuff going on. And so that's why we go based off of estimates at this point.
I can only imagine what it's doing for the rest of these central services, what's happened in there. So I'm going to need a lot more information before we do any kind of a conversion like this that's being suggested. Thank you, Chair. Yield.
Thanks, sir. And moving on to Amanda Scott, Central Services Allocation Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sean, would you mind answering a couple other questions for clarification purposes? So the most recent discussion up here has concerned the attorney's office and the finance office, and the actual tracking of 6 minutes at a time or something like that as they switch different jobs. That's not what you used to develop the formula for your central services cost allocation, is it?
No, it was different methods for each of the central services.
And can you please specify, I could probably look it up, but I'm hoping that you know it off the top of your head, what were the departments that you considered in your central services cost allocation?
Yes, human resources, finance, IT, legal, and equipment maintenance.
And equipment maintenance. And the total amount of dollars that were allocated out to the enterprise funds for these departments?
It was a little over $2 million. I don't know the specific amount.
And that's fine, that's what I was looking for, was just a rough dollar amount there. Because this then is my follow-up, is that the interdepartmental charges for this year is $5 million. And I believe I'm getting close to that by subtracting out the PILTs that were reinstated. And just my personal opinion, that one always made sense to me. And thank you, Mayor, thank you, Finance Officer, for putting those back, because those are a clear calculation based on a formula, and that is easy to explain. But there's still $5 million. And now, Sean, that you've done this great work and you've actually allocated out, and there's some method to the madness for what the enterprise funds are being charged, this $2 million, that still leaves $3 million being charged to enterprise funds that we don't have good, clear reasons why they're being charged. That was the point I brought up, is that it's that additional $3 million now. Again, I would like to say that they're being charged their right amount. And I would be horrified to say, oh my goodness, we've overcharged them and they are just working their buns off and having to pay the general fund a revenue stream. The fact is, we don't know. And that's my concern. And that's why I have been having this conversation. I know council members are so tired of me bringing this up every year. That's why I keep having this conversation. I'm all about a revenue stream. But when we looked at this in the years past and we found out that it's been abused, that there is no method, that it was abused by past councils and past mayors, that it was a great revenue stream, and if they needed money, let's just add 10% to the interdepartmental charges and collect it from the ratepayers. I just think it's time, and I have thought it's time for the last 4 years, let's dig in. And so, Sean, again, thank you for at least getting a portion of it done. I would really like to see the rest of it done, because I don't have a problem standing up to our enterprise funds, whether it's the airport, civic center, golf courses. Of course, now we got them in the general fund, but any of the enterprise funds, water department, water reclamation, and let them know, yes, this is the actual amount you need to contribute to the general fund. I don't have a problem with that if I can answer what they're actually paying for. So I would just encourage continuation in the 2019 budget. I'd like to see the rest of that $3 million at least be able to be clarified as far as what it's actually being charged to the enterprise funds for. So, and sorry, my other point, Sean, thank you, because my point was this charging of 6 minutes, there's other ways to take a look at the expenses of these departments and reallocating them out to the enterprise funds based on other things rather than tracking 6 minutes at a time. So, thank you, Sean.
Okay, we're coming up on the 2-hour limit, or the 2-hour time, which I tried to set forth as a limit for tonight just because I feel like our brains turned to mush after that time, but I'm going to leave it up to the council as whether or not they want to continue. Obviously, it's not my decision alone. So if you want to continue, I don't know if I need to take a formal vote. What's the general consensus? And maybe we should take a break so everybody can stretch a second if that's what you want to do, but what's the general feeling of the council at this point? Can anybody chime in?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if you're looking for a motion, I'd make a motion that we go ahead and wrap this up for tonight and kind of set a potential agenda for city department directors for Thursday night, pick it up Thursday night at 5:30.
Okay, the motion is to continue to this, on the discussion, so I'll make sure, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Okay, roll call, please.
Half of them voted either way.
Could be. Armstrong. Lewis.
I'm not voting on the chair.
A.
I'm voting in the case of a tie. No? Aye.
Let's see, Modrick. Nordstrom. Drew. Scott. Scott. Drury. Lorente. 6-2.
Okay, well, we'll continue. I would like to take a 10-minute recess for everybody to possibly stretch their legs a little bit, if that's okay with the council? Oh, we voted to adjourn? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought we voted to stay. What do I know? I'm only chairman, so we did. I apologize completely. So we'll be back same time Thursday night. I apologize for that. Wow. At least I did it in public. So we're back Thursday night at 5:30. Thank you.